Silent screams presence. There are stories that stick with you long after they've been told. Stories that leave a mark on your soul, creeping into your thoughts at night. Some stories are best left untold, but in this chilling tale, we dive into the terrifying world of pizza delivery, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs, where the unexpected lurks behind every corner. Welcome to Silent Screams, where the darkness is always close, and the horrors are just a doorbell away. It's a quiet night, one of those nights where the world feels eerily still, almost as if something is waiting, watching. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the cold wind whispers through the trees. For most people, it's just another peaceful evening. But for some, it's the beginning of a nightmare they'll never forget. Mark, a seasoned pizza delivery driver, had seen it all. The late-night runs, the oddball customers, the strange requests, but he never could have imagined the horrors he'd soon encounter. It started with a regular order. A pizza, a tip, and a quick return to the warmth of the car. He pulled out of the familiar parking lot, heading down the darkened streets, the hum of his engine breaking the silence. As he drove through the desolate neighborhood, something felt off. The streets were deserted, no cars, no people, just shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. Mark glanced at the GPS, confirming the address once again. It was a strange house, tucked away at the end of an old street, a place he'd never noticed before, even though he'd made hundreds of deliveries in this area. The house sat at the very edge of the block, its windows dark and uninviting, the porch light flickering erratically, like a dying candle. Mark felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He'd never been a superstitious man, but there was something about this place that made his skin prickle, made him hesitate for just a moment before he put the car in. Park. The wind howled louder, rattling the branches of the gnarled tree in the front yard, as if warning him to leave, but it was too late to turn back. Stepping out of the car, Mark adjusted his jacket and took the pizza from the passenger seat. The door creaked open as he approached, the porch light casting an eerie glow over the path leading to the front door. He rang the doorbell. Nothing. A few moments passed, and still, no one came to answer. Mark's hand hovered over the doorbell again, ready to press it, when a faint noise came from inside, a shuffle, like someone moving slowly, deliberately, just out of sight. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. Mark could hear his heart pounding in his ears, his breath shallow, his every instinct telling him to leave. But then the door creaked open just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Mark hesitated. There was no one standing there. No one to take the pizza. He leaned forward slightly, peering into the shadows. That's when he saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of his vision, something pale, like a figure, drifting just out of reach. His eyes darted to the space, but it was gone. Mark shook his head. Maybe it was his nerves. He took a step back, just about to turn around and leave, when the door swung wide open with a sudden force. A woman stood there, her face pale, eyes wide, too wide. "Are you here for the pizza?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if she hadn't spoken in years. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's a large pepperoni, right?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes never blinking. Mark felt a chill race down his spine. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and there was an unsettling silence between them. He handed her the pizza, and as she took it, her fingers brushed his hand, ice cold. A jolt of fear shot through him, and his breath hitched. The woman's grip tightened around the box, her fingers trembling now, but she didn't look away. Her mouth twitched, as if trying to form a smile, but it wasn't a smile at all. It was a grimace, a twisted, unnatural curve of the lips. "Thank you," she murmured, but her voice was not the voice of a human. It sounded like something else, something ancient, something lost. Before Mark could respond, the door slammed shut in his face. He stepped back, confusion and unease filling his chest. He turned to leave, but something made him look over his shoulder one last time. The window above the front door, the one he hadn't noticed before, flickered with a soft glow. For a moment, he swore he saw a figure standing there, watching him, its face pale and expressionless, just like the woman's. Mark's heart raced as he hurried to his car, his feet stumbling over the cracked sidewalk. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, trying to shake the feeling that something had just followed him out. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the house as possible. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The streetlights flickered and dimmed as he passed, casting long, stretching shadows across the empty road. He looked in his rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind him was dark and empty. But when he turned his eyes forward again, the image of the woman's face, pale and twisted, flashed in his mind. He slammed on the brakes, his heart stopping for a beat. The figure in his mirror, she was there, right behind him, standing in the middle of the road. Mark's hands shook as he turned the wheel, speeding off down a different street. His mind raced. Had he just imagined it? Was he losing his grip on reality? His eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement, any hint that someone or something was following him. But the streets were empty. Silent. As he continued his drive, a strange sound filled the car, a faint whisper. Barely audible. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he realized it was coming from the back seat. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, but there was no one there. Just the dark, empty road behind him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if it was right next to him. Mark's pulse quickened. He whipped his head around to check the back seat, but it was still empty. Just a shadow. A figure. A presence. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. His breath caught in his throat as the whispers grew louder, more coherent. The words, he could almost hear them now. "Turn back," they whispered. "Don't go home," they urged. Mark felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He pressed the gas pedal harder, hoping the sound would stop, praying that whatever was in the car with him would just leave. But it didn't. It only grew louder. More desperate. The road ahead seemed endless, a dark tunnel stretching into the unknown, and with every mile, the whispers grew stronger, the air colder, as if something was closing in on him. And then, in the distance, he saw it again, the same flickering light. The house. The same house. No matter how far he drove, he always seemed to end up back here. The night was far from over. Mark slammed his foot down harder on the accelerator, the tires screeching as his car lurched forward. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again, not after what he saw. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white as his mind raced to process what was happening. He could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the air like a chilling fog, whispering words that didn't belong in the world of the living. "Turn back, leave this place," they hissed, their voices almost drowned out by the hum of the engine. It felt like the road stretched on forever, but despite his speed, Mark knew, deep down, he knew that he was being pulled back. The house. The same house. It was impossible. He had left it miles behind, or so he thought. His pulse quickened as he glanced out the window, only to find the dim glow of that flickering porch light appearing in the distance. Slowly at first, then faster, as if it was chasing him. The dark trees lining the road seemed to lean inward, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement, as if they were alive, reaching for him. He wanted to scream, to slam the brakes, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop. Someone was controlling his every move, guiding him toward that house. And then, the headlights illuminated it, just ahead, standing eerily still in the night, as though it had never moved. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach. The house was exactly where he left it, at the end of that desolate street, its porch light flickering, casting an unnatural glow that felt like it was beckoning him, calling him back. Mark's instincts screamed at him to keep driving, to get as far away as possible, but the car came to an unexplainable stop, as if an invisible force had grabbed hold of the brakes. His breath came in shallow gasps. He was frozen, unable to move. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly, his fingers numb, but still, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the house. The door. The porch. The same woman, standing in the doorway, her face as pale as the moonlight, her eyes wide and unblinking, locked onto him. She wasn't smiling. No, it wasn't a smile. It was something worse. Something unsettling. The corners of her mouth twitched, but it wasn't natural. It was like a mask trying to shift into something that didn't belong. Mark didn't know how he knew, but he felt it in his bones. This wasn't a simple house. This wasn't just some strange person. There was something wrong with that place. With her. Something ancient, something evil. The cold air grew thicker, pressing against him as if trying to suffocate him. His heart raced, his throat tight as the whispers swirled in his ears again. Don't go inside, don't let her in, don't. His thoughts were broken by a sudden, loud bang. His car jerked violently, the windows rattling, and for a moment, everything went black. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him in complete silence, the only sound the pounding of his heart. Mark struggled to turn the key, his hands trembling, but the car wouldn't start. The engine refused to turn over, as if it were dead. He cursed under his breath, throwing the car door open, his legs unsteady as he stepped into the night. The cold air hit him like a slap, freezing his skin. Every breath felt like ice entering his lungs. He had no choice but to face it. The house. The woman. The feeling that something beyond his understanding was waiting for him. Mark's feet shuffled across the gravel, each step heavier than the last. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his body betrayed him. It was as though the house was pulling him forward, as if the very earth beneath his feet was forcing him to go closer. The door to the house creaked open slowly, revealing that same woman, no longer standing but waiting, watching, her presence more unsettling than ever. Her eyes never left him as he approached, those dark, hollow pupils too wide, too unnatural. Mark could feel her gaze boring into him, digging under his skin, crawling through his veins. The world around him seemed to fade, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. The whispers in the air were louder now, more insistent. Come inside, it's safe, we've been waiting for you. His legs moved on their own accord, each step leading him closer to the door. Mark wanted to fight it, to scream, to run, but something was holding him there. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, stretching like claws over the front yard, reaching for him. The woman stepped aside, her smile still twisted, a grotesque parody of friendliness. Come inside, Mark, we've been waiting for you, she repeated, her voice an odd mix of warmth and malice. His body moved forward, every instinct telling him to turn around, but it was as if his feet were glued to the ground. His hands shook as he reached out, grasping the cold, weathered doorknob. As soon as his fingers touched it, the whispers grew louder, filling his head, drowning out all rational thought. Suddenly, There was a flash of movement behind him, a shadow, darting across the yard, too fast to see clearly. Mark whipped around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing there. Just the wind and the trees. But as his gaze returned to the doorway, the woman was gone. The door slammed open by itself. Inside was a dimly lit hallway, the floor covered in dust and debris. The air felt thick, as though it hadn't been breathed in years. Mark's stomach twisted, and for the first time since he arrived, fear began to gnaw at him. He didn't want to step inside, but again, his body betrayed him. His feet carried him over the threshold, into the darkness of the house. The hallway stretched infinitely ahead, its walls lined with old paintings that seemed to shift, the faces in the frames contorting into grotesque expressions as he passed. The air was so heavy, so oppressive, that Mark could barely breathe. He felt like he was walking through a fog, each step making the world around him feel more unreal, more dangerous. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from deeper within the house. Not his. Someone else was inside with him. The cold air was thick with dread. Mark's eyes darted around the hallway, searching for the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence, broken only by the creaking of the house itself. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling through the crack. The same flickering, unnatural light that came from the porch. It beckoned to him. His legs moved toward it, despite every fiber of his being telling him to turn around and run. As he approached the door, the whispers became clearer, louder. Now, they weren't just voices in the wind. They were words, real words. Commands. Don't open the door, it's not for you, don't, but it was too late. His hand reached out, trembling, and pushed the door open. Inside was a room that seemed too large for the house. It was dim, its walls covered in strange symbols, their meaning impossible to decipher. In the center of the room was a figure, seated in a chair, its face obscured by a veil. Mark couldn't see who it was, but the presence was undeniable. Something ancient. Before he could step further into the room, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, but there was no escape. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing inward, suffocating him. Then, the figure in the chair moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stood up. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the figure removed the veil. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Its face was pale, stretched thin, and its eyes, those eyes, were dark, empty pits that seemed to devour everything in their gaze. The figure took a step toward him, and Mark stumbled backward. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his chest tight. The air was too thick, too heavy, to move. The figure smiled, a grotesque, wicked smile that stretched far too wide for any human face. "Welcome, Mark," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 broken voices all speaking at once. "We've been waiting for you." The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Mark's heart raced. Something was coming. Something terrible. Something he couldn't escape,